Hi, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Mathieu, Vibrant Health. We're doing a series of videos interviewing Sally K Norton about the topic of oxalates. And in our continuing journey, today we're showing up with how do oxalates accumulate in the body? And one of the things I want to say to lead off is what makes the topic of oxalate so different from other toxins that we can get into our bodies through our food is, as an example, there's a plant toxin called lectin, which can do a lot of damage to the body. But when we stop eating lectins, the body can heal often pretty quickly from that. There's other toxins very similar, like the toxins that people get when they eat gluten, celiac disease. And again, when people stop eating gluten, their body can heal from that pretty quickly. In oxalates, we're dealing with a really different type of toxin in that the body can only excrete so much in a given day. And if you ingest more than that, the body is forced to start putting it into storage. And that storage can be in all the tissues throughout the entire body. And again, I welcome Sally K Norton as my special guest today to dive into this topic with us. And I just want to give Sally a quick introduction. Sally's become a world expert on oxalates. Her cover of her book is right behind her, Toxic Superfoods, that came out in January of 2023. And it's now become a bestseller. And people are starting to take notice. And we're intending to just, this isn't to be a replacement of Sally's book in any way. But the idea of this is to kind of be a little compendium, if you will, of let's hear people talk about it and make it real. And with me as your special guest, Sally, I've got, from working with Sally as a client myself, I'm kind of at the very high extreme end of what can happen when somebody abuses oxalates and then pays for it with lifetime of chronic health issues. So, and before we dive in more, Sally has her BS in nutrition from Cornell and her master's in public health from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So she's got the science background. She got sick herself and has been healing herself for the last 10 years by being on a low oxalate diet. She works with clients, so she's seen hundreds of people who have gotten sick and she's helping them recover. So with Sally, we've got personal experience. She's dived deep into the science. She's written her book and she works with clients. And I'm one of those clients. So we're going to use me today as somebody to talk about this topic on how the body accumulates oxalates. So again, Sally, thank you for being with us today.
So fun to be with you always, Michael.
Yep. So as an intro to how the body accumulates oxalates, I'm one of those people who accumulated a ton. And now I've been on a low oxalate diet for the last 3.5 years. And by observation, we can see how much I've accumulated, because being on the low oxalate diet for 3.5 years, I'm not out of it in 6 months. I'm still deep in it. And so some of the symptoms that I'm dealing with currently are, I'm going to try to get my face really close to the camera. Don't know if we're going to be able to see it. But if you look at my cheek, you can see I'm dealing with vascular stuff, or vascular trauma, I guess we could say, in my face, in my blood vessels in my face. I think visually it looks like rosacea to me. The other way I guess we could describe it is capillaries that have blown up in my cheeks, in my forehead. I continue to have grit coming out of my eyelids every morning. I have cloudy urine lots of the time. Sometimes there's actually visible crystals in my urine. I have, for the last 6 months, I've had, it's something I didn't have for the first 3 years of low oxalate diet, but now I think my body's getting into some deeper clearing. I've got scabs over my low back, like there's probably 50 scabs. Like I'm guessing that's where oxalates have penetrated the skin and done skin damage coming out, but maybe not. But and then the rest of my back has like little red bumps. And what else did we talk about, Sally?
The muscles?
Oh yeah, I've not sure exactly what's happening, but my muscles feel very crunchy, almost like they've turned to plastic at times. And yes, I do have quadriplegia, but I'm talking about the areas where I do have full sensation. So in my neck, in my upper arms, in my chest. Sometimes it feels like an elephant standing on my chest because things have gotten so tight internally from front to back. And in the past, I've had crystals coming out of my skin. We've got pictures of that. I do have a catheter with a drainage bag for collecting my urine. And we've seen the internal tubing, especially the first year on a low oxalate diet, where that whole interior of the tubing just got frosted white with crystals. And I get times when things are incredibly itchy. My eyelid, the ducts that bring both tears and oil into my eyes get so blocked up. I can barely keep my eyes open because they're so dry. And then sometimes I'll do one of Sally's famous Alka-Seltzer Gold lemon drinks, and with all the citric acid from the lemon juice, and I also put calcium citrate in there to get the more citrate in there. And sometimes within a half hour, all of a sudden, all this junk comes out of my oil glands and tear ducts, and then, oh my God, I've got lubrication in my eyes and things feel normal. So yeah, the list is deep and long. Did I leave out any classic ones, Sally?
The tartar on the teeth is another classic one. And then the mood shifts when your vascular system is all this, it's harder to think. There's a lot of negative thinking. There's a loss of motivation and emotional engagement in life, and sometimes panic attacks or just flat out depression. That's really tough. That's inflammation.
And the anxiety is one for sure. And what's fascinating is I can spend most of my day where feel grounded and solid, and then all of a sudden something will shift, and I could go through an hour or 6 hours where I become irrational and I can barely keep my shit together. And I feel like my life's falling apart and I'm probably going to be dead tomorrow. And then something will shift again. And then it's like, wow, Michael's back. Where the hell did I just go? Yeah.
Yeah, you're haunted with like this weird mental illness that comes in.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've had a lot of trouble with I've always had trouble with loose stools, which I blame on oxalates, but since going low oxalate, I also have a lot of trouble with diarrhea. And I'm kind of forced in a situation where I can't run to the bathroom as a quadriplegic. So I've been doing a lot of bentonite clay as a way of kind of keeping my stools together. So I'm not a S show for the whole day.
Fun times, aren't they, Michael?
Yeah. Yeah. And so part of the message here from Sally and I is don't do what we did. Get this information, educate yourself, know the foods list, and we'll at a future video we'll get more into how to move into a low oxalate diet safely. But we want people to understand why this is so important, why this information on oxalates, because you don't want to go where Sally and I have been, where some of the stuff we've there's some stuff, a lot of stuff is recoverable when you switch the diet. But if you go too far down the oxalate pipeline, it's really possible that you do permanent damage that you can't recover from. And part of our intention is to help people not, to avoid going there.
Prevention is a hard sell, Michael.
I know.
And then you can never prove prevention. Like, it didn't happen.
Exactly.
So you can't prove what made it not happen. So that's always the big debate in prevention public health, which has been my space, my sphere, my home base, my whole life. I was 12 when I decided I want to help people not get sick. And unfortunately, a lot of other people are attempting to help people not get sick, and they're giving them exactly the wrong advice to eat a lot of spinach and almonds and do, gluten-free that adds in buckwheat and high oxalate foods, and it's making the sick person sicker in the long run. We often can't see that. Can't see yourself getting sick. It just ends up in a really tragic place in the long run. But all of this is interesting observations from a scientific point of view. Why would getting off, what were your favorite high oxalate foods in the last, say, 5 or 10 years? What were you eating?
Well, I had gotten off of grains 20 years ago because those weren't working.
So instead of grains, what were you eating?
Oh, well, I was eating, kind of got forced eating meat, winter squash, and zucchini, which all of those are low. But then in my quest to recover after my injury, which was 11 years ago, I thought, oh, I got to start juicing. So I would juice a head of romaine, but I would put a half a bunch of parsley in there. And then I would put probably like an inch of ginger root. And I was doing that 3 times a day. And even though romaine is incredibly low, a 2-pound head of romaine lettuce, that starts getting up there a little bit in how much there is. And then
it's a lot of fiber and a lot of things that eventually become irritants to the immune system too.
Yeah. I started getting into fermenting, and I was fermenting carrots, which are kind of medium high, but I was there's days I'd eat a half cup of fermented carrots or a full cup. And then I kept thinking getting nuts back in would be a good thing. So I was dehydrating almonds and walnuts, and I don't think I got back into cashews. Then I was making kvass out of fermented beets. And I feel like I'm forgetting one of the obvious ones. Anyway,
turmeric.
But I know one of the things I've learned from you, Sally, is with big levels of trauma like I experienced, not only when I crashed, but then a neck surgery, and then a month and a half later, a neck surgery that failed and had to be done again. And then all the antibiotics and all the other imaging contrast dyes and everything else I was exposed to. And then they put me on a feeding tube, and they were feeding me a grain-based, thing you put in a tube and stuff into my belly. So I'm sure my level of absorption was probably off the charts because my gut was so leaky and so messed up.
Right. And this is a really, really important point, that just a little bit of parsley in the juice when you've got leaky gut is a serious level of oxalate exposure. So it doesn't necessarily take the ongoing high oxalate diet that you had back in the days of the whole wheat bread and the almond butter all the time. It's just that there's enough oxalate still, and you have the leaky gut, and the overall, your whole system now is just struggling to keep the inflammation under control that's simmering under the surface. And then you went through so much trauma, that's physical trauma to tissues, and that's where oxalate tends to accumulate, wherever you have inflammation, injury, regenerating tissues. So any amount of healing going on post-surgery, all those areas where the surgical scars are, where the sutures, where the parts and pieces they stick into your body, whether it's just for an injection for a dye or whether it's a piece that's holding you back together. This is all areas that become sticky to oxalate. The oxalate in the food gets in your blood, then it goes from being oxalic acid, what we call precipitates out into these little invisible nanocrystals that start collecting in these areas where you have tissue debris and tissues trying to recover. So anywhere, I mean, it could be from typing all day, could be from a burn, or it could be from an accident or a surgery, or just life, where regenerating or inflamed or infected tissues are collecting oxalate. And that's a big problem.
Of course, yeah. And of course, now I'm remembering a couple of the major obvious ones is on weekends, Beth and I would often make sweet potato and white potato oven fries. And
delicious.
you can eat a lot more oven fries than, one baked potato is usually enough. But between the two of us, we'd have like 3 white potatoes and a couple of big sweet potatoes. So
one meal.
Just for one meal, and we might do it twice on a weekend. So we were hammering it pretty hard.
Ouch.
And then Beth was a total chipmeister for quite a while. So she'd kind of home from work and she'd get the potato chip bag out and I would join her until finally, like 5 years ago, I was like, the oils, they use seed oils and then they use them over and over. They're heating them to death.
They often use cottonseed oil, which is the very, very heavily sprayed with herbicides and fungicides. And so the cottonseed oil is uber toxic just from the herbicides and the pesticides on it.
Yeah. And I think we mostly were buying organic ones. So it was sunflower or safflower oil.
Okay, good.
But they use
these oils. How did we justify eating potato chips? How did we do that? Like, what are we telling ourselves that was okay? Do you remember the mindset of that?
They taste good. They're crunchy. They're salty and fatty. There you go.
Yeah, it's strictly hedonism. Is that all it is? It's like hedonism. We don't need to justify it because, hey, I'm tired. I had a hard week at work. I deserve a break. It's cheaper than a vacation. Let's open up some.
Yeah, pretty much.
Right. It's a shortcut to fun, I guess.
Yeah. Yep.
Instead of having real fun. Open some chips.
Yeah.
I don't think we let ourselves play enough, and that's probably promoting this kind of behavior, right? So
yeah,
you're what I call a really fat scientific data point. When we switch our diets, some weird stuff starts happening. And this is confirming what we see in the medical literature, that actually we end up with crystals in all kinds of tissues, and the breast tissue, and the thyroid gland is really remarkable because 85% of us will have big enough oxalate crystals that they can see them in a microscope if they properly prepare the tissue. If it's a fresh sample from a biopsy or from a autopsy, from an autopsy or a biopsy sample, they'll take a look at it. They have to freeze it or make it solid so they can do a really thin slice and somehow slice it without slicing out the crystals that are there. But you have to do that pretty quickly within 2 hours, and you have to do it right with the right dye and the right polarized light to be able to see the crystals. So even with all these technical challenges of needing the right samples and all, they find it in 85% of thyroids that they've looked at of people who are over age 50. The younger you are, the less crystals, the smaller and harder to see they are. But over time, as you live many decades, eating potatoes, eating sweet potatoes, having peanut butter, whole wheat toast, having nuts now and then, having Reese's peanut butter cups, having chocolate desserts, chocolate snacks, holiday chocolate. There's always an excuse to eat an oxalate. And we start early. I mean, little kids get sweet potatoes and even spinach in baby foods. So you get off the breasts, and the moms, it's even possible to get oxalate through breast milk if a mom is eating a lot of high oxalate foods. Or used to, even if she stopped, because oxalate can come out through these fluids, like in the eyes. So eyes, glands, all kinds of tissues end up holding on to oxalate either by accident because those tissues were just sticky and didn't have the metabolic heft to protect themselves or rebuff these crystals. The crystals get stuck on the cellular debris or the cells that are inflamed, infected, or regenerating. There's a chemical state that changes their physical orientation of the molecules on these membranes that makes them more sticky. And when the system is all inflamed like that, there's not as much healthy cells nearby to kind of limit the crystal development. And so the crystals can get fairly large in these areas. And over time, eventually the immune system tries to cover them up so they quit growing or they quit reacting with the local tissue, because a crystal has lots of problems. It's not only sharp, but it has electromagnetic charges on it that affect the charges of the cell membrane and cause membrane structural damage. So the membrane structure changes and makes the cells leaky to calcium, and makes the cell look like it's damaged, because it is, and that tells the immune system to come attack it. It affects the mitochondria, which are an internal organism or an internal organelle in a cell made of double membrane. And in fact, all the little organelles in a cell are membrane structures, because all the activity of life itself is happening on membranes, and just the electromagnetic nature apparently of these crystals is enough to disrupt membrane structures essential to function is compromised, and you start losing mitochondrial function and so on. But even if it's just oxalic acid that's not crystallizing, that's affecting cells. And so you can affect the cells with the acid, and then because the cell is sick and dying, it becomes sticky to oxalate. So even if the cell wasn't injured from a surgery or accident or overuse during the day, or just, multiplying because its days are numbered, it needs babies, the acid itself can start creating its damage in tissues. And that's kind of the beginning step of the crystal accumulation in tissue. So the body can only handle so much in the vascular system and in the kidneys. And it's really important to not leave oxalate in the vascular system, wrecking your red blood cells and your white blood cells. That's your immune system. So the oxalic acid running around in your bloodstream damages immune cells and compromises your immune system, the ability to protect yourself. So the kidneys can only deal with so much, and the more they have to deal with, the harder it is for them to deal with it. And they either start accumulating it themselves just to keep you from getting kidney stones, because the kidneys will start pulling in the oxalate into the kidney tissue in order to keep the urine properly flowing so you don't end up with kidney stones. So you can handle a lot of oxalate and not get kidney stones, but in the meantime, you're accumulating. But studies
Can I stop you,
there.
Sal? Can I stop you?
Yeah.
I didn't hear you for about 30 seconds.
Oh.
So you were talking about the kidneys keeping the urine flow going, and then you said a little more after that.
Yeah, so the kidneys are keeping the urine flowing so you have urine that's not giving you kidney stones, and the price you pay for that is something called nephrocalcinosis, where the kidneys fill up with calcium oxalate in the non-flow areas, these tubules where the urine's flowing. So the kidneys are filling up. In the meantime, so are other tissues in the body filling up with oxalate, because after you had that fantastic potato fry party, you were really, really high in oxalate in the body. And so that's when you're collecting oxalate, waiting for a moment. You're really waiting for a 3-day period where you're not eating high oxalate foods, but maybe you had some parsley juice the next day, and maybe you had some hash browns, or maybe you had some whole wheat toast, or you had something every day. Maybe it's enough oxalate. The body, it doesn't lower the oxalate level in the surrounding tissues or in the bloodstream or in the kidneys long enough for the body to have enough sort of freedom to release oxalate that it's holding on to. Does that make any sense at all?
It does, and it's a lot too.
It's a lot. And your doctor was told, and is still told, that you require renal failure where you're basically on dialysis or nearly on dialysis before this accumulation occurs. Well, if that's true, and if 85% of us have crystals in our thyroid gland, are 85% of us on renal support by the time we're 50 years old? I don't think so. No. And we see that throughout, where it's 12 or 15% of breast biopsies or even mammograms demonstrate oxalate crystals in the breast. There's not even 12% of us on renal support, and very few breast cancer patients are renal patients. It's not that everybody with breast problems are renal patients. It's a foolish notion that the body is not trying to manage this toxicity in a way. It's kind of like cleaning your bedroom by sticking everything under the bed because you had to do that. That was the only choice at the moment. That was the emergency plan so you could walk across the room and not fall on your face. That's the body is doing some smart work, but expecting you to not be eating these high oxalate foods because we didn't used to eat them like that. So there's this scientific theory about what's called trigger and maintenance that I talk about in chapter 9 of the book. And it seems confusing, but it's real simple. If you eat enough oxalate and it raises the blood level enough, that triggers new deposits in the body. And then amount you need for that is probably 1.5 ounces or 2 ounces of chocolate. It's probably not very much. That would be, I'm guessing, 1/3 of a sweet potato is enough to trigger new deposits in the body. And a little bit less than that, maybe 1/4 of a sweet potato is enough to maintain the deposits. So with trigger and maintenance, you have enough every time you eat what's a standard food. Often you're triggering new deposits, and then just a real casual low level of oxalate coming in maintains them. So we rarely go below this trigger maintenance. If you get rid of the triggers and the maintenance, then the body wants to stop accumulating oxalate and tries to deaccumulate the oxalate. And that's what we do when we go on a low oxalate diet. And this is a problem if you have a lot of oxalate in your tissues, which many people do, because you can become toxic all over again in ways that are even worse than it was on the way in. And that's because it's additional inflammation required when you're digging the crystals out of your skin and your neck and your muscles and your tendons and your thyroid gland. It's the immune system doing that, and it has to turn on these pro-inflammatory signals that says, bring more white blood cells over here to fight this battle and dig up this toxic mess that causes inflammation, that dilates your capillaries and brings in immune system activity, that brings in more pro-inflammatory cytokines, that increases acidity in the body. And then it starts breaking down and releasing oxalic acid, which increases acidity in the body, which causes vascular distress and can wreck capillary beds. And you're seeing some of that oxidative stress in your face today. And probably your brain isn't nice and sharp because of it. Are you noticing that? Like harder
Mixed
to think?
today. I'm mostly good, but yeah, there's a little bit of a mild cloud, I guess I say.
Well, sometimes the cloud is just, I'm not loving life today, or I'm just like whining in my head, or very kind of have a negative attitude about things, or a little bit irritable. That's another one that comes on. But anyway, this pro-inflammatory state is what's needed to get rid of the crystals. And then when you get rid of the crystals, you're releasing oxalic acid back into tissues, which is a toxic state. So it's important to recognize that on the kind of foods that we grew up on, the potato products and the chocolate and the peanuts and the whole wheat bread, that's enough because they're daily staples. Like who doesn't have, like if they love potatoes, you go out for either fries or chips at lunch. At dinner, it's either baked fries or chips. Breakfast is hash browns. Like it's really easy to get into a potato habit or a peanut or nut habit, or using chocolate as a little treat in the afternoon or as a dessert with dinner. And it's just available all the time. Tea is another one people use on a daily basis. If you're going gluten-free, you might add buckwheat or quinoa or teff on a daily basis. This is
Now we're talking about me again in my 20s.
Yeah, because you realized like the bread wasn't getting along with you anymore, so you went gluten-free.
Well, I found out that I had some testing done and found out that gluten probably wasn't working for me. And so I started shifting towards buckwheat and later quinoa and a little bit of amaranth in there too. And it turns out those are even higher in oxalate than wheat is.
Much higher.
Yeah.
I used to love the soba noodles, the Japanese noodles.
Yep. Oh, buckwheat pancakes. Oh my God, I'd die for those.
And I used to like make teff like pudding for breakfast with a little bit of cocoa powder in it. Teff and cocoa. It was like kind of like cocoa, what was it called? Cocoa wheats or something. Remember that? Remember cream of wheat? It was like the chocolate version of cream of wheat. Well, I used to make that with teff.
Oh, I don't know that one.
Yeah, just a little bit
Oh
of
yeah.
maple syrup, a little bit of cocoa powder, and a cooked
Yeah.
tough breakfast cereal.
Yeehaw, baby. Hey, can we circle around just to dive in a little bit more to trigger and maintenance theory?
Mhm. Yeah, so trigger
So
maintenance.
yeah, so I want to make sure, see if I can understand it, and if I don't get it right, just correct me. So if we're not eating too much oxalate, our body can handle a certain amount a day and clear it out, and then we don't go into storage at all. So that's kind of like one category, right?
Right.
And then if we eat a little bit more than that, it might be at a level where, well, I guess it would be if we're eating a little bit more than our body can handle, but not a ridiculous amount. Our body may go into times when it's like, oh, that's enough for today. We're going to put some of that into storage. Do I kind of have that right?
Yeah, that would be a trigger dose.
That would be a trigger dose. Okay. So
That's the
that
trigger
could
dose.
be,
Is
I
that
mean,
enough that where it suddenly is setting up new deposits? The trigger is like new deposits. So
yeah.
and the new deposit can be some other new place that doesn't have deposits yet.
And that can be anywhere in the body, correct?
Pretty much anywhere it can get to, which requires capillaries to get it there because it's coming into your bloodstream from your food.
So that can be in your muscles, it can be in your skin, it can be in your organs, it can cross blood-brain barrier. And you're pointing to your eye, it can get into your eyes, and it's especially prone to accumulate in places with higher metabolic activity because there's more blood flow going to that area. Is that?
It seems to be glands like to collect a lot of stuff. I consider them little factories. They sweep in lots of material, hoping to have enough stuff so they can make what they like to make. I think they're designed to pull in a lot of stuff from the interstitial fluid around them, and they tend to pick it up. They're high metabolic activity areas of a lot of use and a lot of calcium, like your teeth and jaw and your sinuses. Lots of circulation, lots of bones, little fine, thin bones, creating this architecture of the face and the sinuses, very prone to oxalate accumulation. Your bone marrow picks up oxalate. The bones, seems to be, to me, that's where it shakes out over time. Like it might set up in some tissue and the tissue tries to process it and get rid of it. And sometimes if it's still not really releasing it, somehow it seems to like over time be more and more in the bones, which is, calcium is a magnet for oxalate.
And then if you're at kind of a certain level, like say a maintenance level where you're eating enough oxalate so the body doesn't go into oxalate clearing mode, but you're not eating too much so it's trigger, you can kind of get into this area where you kind of just are maintaining whatever's accumulated in the past.
Right. And that's
right?
probably a sweet zone in terms of I feel fine. I feel fine. I eat a little oxalate, no problem. I feel fine. And it's a useful sweet spot later because if the body's clearing too much, we can maybe get it back into maintenance zone. We can speak back and say, you know what? I'm still eating oxalate. We want to get it to maintenance. So you don't have to be afraid. We'll talk about this later of including some oxalate in the diet because it can be what I call a throttle for reining in the enthusiasm for heavy deaccumulation, which we'll talk about later. I don't want to get too deep in that, but just preview that because that's the big question, like, what to do with the diet, which we'll do later. The interesting thing about trigger and maintenance is A, they've done these studies, and B, it totally works in real life. So, and that's what we'll talk about in the future. But what I found really interesting is the various pathology studies that I would see would describe crystals carefully that they found in tissue studies and say it was wrapped in DNA or it was wrapped in dead white immune cells. And then the other studies about what's something called the net. The immune cells will come around to something they're trying to deal with, and they'll extrude their DNA out of them, and they'll use them to wrap up something and trap it. So it's called a trap or a net, extracellular trap. So it's a ET and net. So this literally, it's almost like slow motion Spider-Man fingers. These immune cells come along and they go, it's a little bit slower motion than Spider-Man, but it's the same concept. Give up their DNA in order to bundle up and coat these crystals. And that kind of eliminates the electromagnetic charge and prevents the crystals from growing bigger and encapsulates them. So you see this unconnected to the more current research on the nets. You see these older pathology studies describing DNA wrappings, or the other kind of wrapping they describe are dead white blood cells. That's a process called granuloma. So the granuloma forms when an immune cell comes along and it tries to eat the crystal, right? So immune cells have this, and cells have this ability to envelop with their membrane and pull something into them. But the crystal's too big for one poor little white blood cell. So a bunch of them come along, maybe 10 or 12 of them say, let's be one big cell together. And they become a giant cell. Literally, that's the scientific term. Giant cells, this is immune cells busy trying to eat stuff, try to eat the crystal. And that sometimes doesn't work. It's called frustrated phagocytosis. Help me talk today. I'm the one whose brain isn't working. This frustration causes a release of more cytokines that say, immune system, come over here. This is a real pain in the neck. Come help us. And you start enveloping this in layers and layers of white blood cells, and they build up, and that's called a granuloma. Now, eventually, the granuloma process, if the body's well regulated and well nourished and able to handle it, and is able to stop and go, you know what? This isn't working. This isn't working. Let's just quit here. And all these white cells that are trying to deal with this nasty crystal just die and create this capsule of dead white blood cells. And now it's basically an old dead granuloma, which is better than an active granuloma, because active granuloma becomes an autoimmune disease. And people have sarcoidosis and various autoimmune diseases that are granuloma type diseases. And so oxalates can very much be the reason why we have these granuloma diseases, when that whole process has trouble turning itself off. So you can have zero symptoms because the immune cells have done such a great job with these nets and these granulomas that just package the crystals and keep them quiescent, carefully wrapped, like little super fun barrels sitting in your tendons and your thyroid gland. So it's happening, but your doctor doesn't know they're there. And we never knew that when you go on a low oxalate diet, that this is now encouraging the body to now with normal metabolism, you wouldn't want to leave particulate debris, toxic debris hanging around in your thyroid gland and your tendons. Now that you have healthier metabolism, you're not adding more. You're not in this, what we call sequestration mode, because you're eating it all the time. Now, when you have normal tissue turnover, you rediscover these things and turn on these processes that allow us to clean it out. But that's difficult. When you're producing cloudy urine, have crystals coming out of your face and having diarrhea and having eye grit and all these things, this is stressful on the body. And too much of that stress on the body creates chronic inflammation, and chronic inflammation generally causes disease.
Can granulomas be seen in any kind of imagery?
I believe they can. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know about MRIs and CT scans. That would be interesting to look at. What I always believe it was done with biopsy, where you take a tissue specimen and you look at it under a microscope, and that's called pathology versus radiology.
Yeah. So how do people learn that they have granulomas?
Well, sometimes they get a diagnosis, and sometimes it's sort of obvious. I think it's similar to having a tendency to form cysts, which is another thing that happens with these crystals, is that the body has cysts that is an inflammatory process or a fatty process, where fatty molecules are used to envelop little nanocrystals, and you get what's called a lipid crystal. So that's a kind of accumulation that has no visibility. You cannot really test for it in any way. You certainly can never see it on a microscope, even an electron microscope. They're so little, they're smaller than nanocrystals, they're really little. And you get these lipid crystals probably in the liver. And later on, that stuff can also be coming out, but it's not like whole chunky crystals. So there's all these layers of, okay, so the acid starts to becoming nanocrystals, and they get handled differently in different tissues. And very little of this has been directly studied. These are often case studies and pathology studies, and a little bit of a case series. You take a series of tissue samples from a tissue bank, and you start looking at a certain kind of tissue like the thyroid gland, and you start to see, oh, well, this 80% of them had oxalate crystals. How interesting is that? And then they'll make a guess about why. The guess is often, well, the thyroid was failing and therefore the crystal stuck there. And that could be that there was some inflammation or pathology that helped the crystals sticking there. And once you get them sticking, they're creating more damage. You have more this vicious cycle of tissue degeneration and bringing in inflammation that causes more stickiness in the tissue. So it can build up in ways that can be silent. Often there's no symptoms of this, but when there are symptoms, you would never connect it to your sweet potato habit, that it was because you've been eating sweet potatoes the last month that you start to have an achy back or start to have other issues. And some of the things that are occurring, like the development of osteopenia and osteoporosis and the weakening of the connective tissues, are gradual, slow, progressive diseases that are occurring over decades.
Have you come across in the research anything with, since you mentioned cysts just a few minutes ago, where there could be, have they done any biopsies, say, of a cyst in a thyroid or in a breast or in an ovary or a uterus, where the cystic tissue has more oxalates in it? Has there anything been done like that? Or the other end of that would be, observationally, are you seeing those cysts go away when people go low oxalate? Which isn't necessarily the same thing, but
I've definitely had people who gain cysts on the oxalate recovery that go away, or had a series of cysts in the past that go away. We see cysts dissolving, very interesting kinds of cysts, things you would never expect. It's like new science in a way. And in the literature, it's really not talked about enough. You don't really hear people who are talking about sarcoidosis and stuff talking about the oxalate crystal that may have been the seed that started some of these cysts. But there's a pathologist, Dr. Rosen, who was very verbal about that and just used social media to put out his pictures. It's almost as if nobody wanted to publish his opinion that all of these sarcoidosis cysts had oxalate crystals in the middle of them. I don't remember finding him in the literature, but he was on social media sharing his pictures and explaining this as a pathologist, this is what I always see. So I find that interesting that there's a limited number of reports when people are so adamant that this isn't going on, and yet it's not there in the literature. Or if it's there, it's just a few cases, or putting it together like, well, when we actually report on the nature of these crystals, we see these DNA wrappings, these white cell wrappings, we see this. And when someone who specializes in looking at sarcoidosis and pathology sees always an oxalate crystal there. And I think one reason is because crystals happen anyway all over the body as part of pathology, and they assume that the type of crystal doesn't really matter. There's a lot of assumptions that go into that. And there's also you have to know what you're doing to prove that crystal was oxalate, because the crystal can look the same as other kinds of crystals. And so when they really do care which kind of crystal it is, you have to be really, really sure that you've done everything correct to demonstrate that it's this kind of crystal. But in fact, because oxalate can cause aberrant movement of calcium and other electrolytes, you can have other forms of calcium crystals and other forms of crystallization that are a result of pathologies that might have been kicked off by the oxalate damage in the tissues. So it's complicated. And so it's much better to work backwards from, hey, Michael quit eating sweet potatoes and and oven fries, and now he's got crystals coming out of his body everywhere you can think of. Like that is very, to me, what I call rock solid evidence. When you have rocks coming out of your body, I was shocked when people started reporting they're having crystals, frankly, showing up on the surface of their body. For me, it was always cloudy urine, cloudy urine, cloudy urine. I have champion kidneys and a great urinary tract that has put up with this without UTIs, without interstitial cystitis, without any serious pathology in my urinary tract. I have been able, thank God, to pee out a lot of oxalate over many, many decades, including this last near decade of oxalate clearing from my tissues. That's real. And the fact that I no longer see the cloudy urine very often at all, a few times a month now, I think I should start. I'm not real good at keeping records, but it's very unusual now for me to see it on an everyday kind of pattern. I used to see it 3-4 times a day. Cloudy urine.
That's
like
huge.
Huge. And now I see it 3 or 4 times a month. It's a way better life.
So Sally, oh, go ahead.
No, I'm done.
I was just wanted to say, we've got about 3-4 minutes to wrap things up for today. One thing before you do that, just to flesh out the trigger and maintenance theory with one last piece, is my understanding correct that if you're eating at a level where it's more maintenance, but then say you have the spinach salad with 400 milligrams of oxalate, which is a huge trigger dose, that it not only triggers you in the moment to start storing oxalates, but that storage can be triggered to happen for the next 3-4 days or so. Do I have that right, or am I misunderstanding?
I don't think we know enough about this physiology to know more than what we can gain from putting radioactive oxalate in rats to watch where it goes. Like, how much can we give them? We give them one trigger dose plus some maintenance dose, and they see through radioactive, you sacrifice the animal and you separate out the skin, the organs, the bones, the muscles, and then you test with radiography how much radiation is there, which then you can calculate how much oxalate accumulated. So that's how we know about trigger and maintenance, is through putting radioactive oxalate into rats. And it's done in a way where you see the final conclusion, because you have to sacrifice the animals to see what's going on. So you need to probably quadruple the number of animals and then sacrifice them at each moment in the process to be able to watch this process go. And it would take more money, more people willing to handle radioactive rats, which is really probably only safe to do for a few weeks at a time. So it's high risk research, high cost research. It takes a very skilled set of researchers to do it, and somebody really committed to do it. And so the woman who was doing some of the best stuff currently in the current generation, there was stuff done in the 80s and the 60s. It was the 1960s when the trigger and maintenance theory was proposed. And then more recently, where various radioactive animal studies demonstrated how this works. So it's really just, as long as you've had one trigger dose and you've continued maintenance doses, you're going to maintain those deposits. And every time you add a trigger dose, you're going to increase the number of places where deposits are occurring in the body. And the bottom line is that the way we eat in modern life is that you're probably getting trigger doses multiple times a day. And it's rare to only get maintenance doses, and it's almost never happens that you get below a maintenance dose until you go on a fully animal-based diet, or just get really lucky and just like, white flour, orange juice, ham, kind of like some of the standard sort of not so nutritious food, the kind of stuff they might feed you in the hospital in the old days, is kind of low oxalate. So you could have a pretty low oxalate diet. In fact, this is one way it often happens, is that you go in for surgery. So you quit eating for a day and a half before surgery, and you don't eat again for another day and a half. And you have that 3-day clean out period of no oxalate in your diet. And that can trigger a deaccumulation event where suddenly you don't feel good a few days after surgery as you're coming off pain meds. And you assume it's the surgery, you're off the pain meds, things are going to hurt some more. But you're also maybe triggering some oxalate clearing from short fasts like you would do for surgery.
Awesome. So just to wrap things up, what would you like people to take away from today's talk?
Well, oxalates are developing in our bodies, in our bones, in our glands, and that's bad news to have toxic nanoparticles and microcrystals in your tissues, and that's going to set you up for problems later. And when you change your diet, it's going to take years. Hopefully, slowly, you can get this stuff out safely if it goes slow. So there is this long period of recovery from it. And the truth is, your doctor doesn't know. The doctors are trained to believe that you don't get oxalate accumulation until you have renal failure. So don't expect to have a rational conversation with someone in standard healthcare, because what they're being told is that what we're experiencing couldn't possibly be. But I believe your body, not their mistaken idea that you don't accumulate oxalate on a standard diet, even with perfect kidneys. So you can have great kidneys and still have oxalates in your thyroid gland.
And most urologists aren't going to recommend a low oxalate diet unless someone has kidney stones or renal failure. Is that right?
That's right. And even with kidney stones, they're often reluctant to suggest it because they believe that not eating spinach is dangerous.
Yeah. And I had one caregiver who told me her dad had to go on a low oxalate diet. Well, no, her dad had kidney stones, and the doctor, the only thing he said was, don't eat spinach.
We're not very curious about how oxalate's been working. That's why we're all in the dark about it. And that's how you and I got so sick, because not our professors, not our healthcare providers, not our colleagues, no one knew to say eating those kinds of foods will make you sick in the long run.
Yeah.
So we'll make our little effort to see if anyone wants to hear us.
Yeah, we're doing our best. Well, once again, Sally, it's always a delight to talk with you and to flesh this information out and get it out to people. So thank you for helping and or helping. God, for everything you've been doing. You've committed your life to it. It's pretty amazing. So thanks for all of that. And
I'm so glad you're willing to share your story with the world, because it's so inspiring.
Yeah, it's kind of like I don't have a choice at this point, right?
It's so amazing to live in this weird space of recovery from such a horrible toxicity disease. But the truth is, we're still alive and we're getting better, which is even more amazing, pretty exciting.
Sorry. All right, then. Well, again, thank you, Sally. And thanks everybody for watching. And we're going to keep unfolding the story. And so until next time, everyone, be well. And love you guys. Love you, Sally.
Love you, Michael.
And we'll see you in another month, probably.
That'd be great.